Every Sunday, Rebecca handed her daughter-in-law a mop the moment she walked through the door. Clear the table, wash the dishes, scrub the floor before dessert. Emily never argued. She simply did it, every single week, for 3 years. What Rebecca never realized was that her son had come home early, more times than she knew, standing quietly by the hallway, watching every single Sunday she thought no one else could see. Before we begin tonight, if stories like this move you, take a moment to press that subscribe button, then leave a comment below. Now let's begin, because what David is about to walk in on this particular Sunday has been happening every single week for 3 years, right under his own roof, without him ever once seeing it firsthand. David and Emily had been married just over 3 years, a quiet, steady partnership built on shared mornings and easy conversation, the kind of marriage that never needed grand gestures to feel solid. Every Sunday since the wedding, the two of them drove across town for dinner at Rebecca's house, a tradition David's mother had insisted on from the very beginning. Family time, she called it, something she considered non-negotiable. David loved these dinners, genuinely, seeing them as a comforting constant in an otherwise busy week, a chance to sit at his childhood table and watch his mother fuss over the meal the way she always had. What David rarely saw, because he was almost always occupied helping his mother in the kitchen or catching up with his brother-in-law in the living room, was exactly how those Sunday evenings actually unfolded for Emily, the moment she walked through the front door. Rebecca had developed, over the 3 years since the wedding, a specific and unspoken routine. The moment Emily arrived, Rebecca would hand her an apron before either of them had even finished greeting each other, directing her toward the kitchen to help finish the meal, then toward the dining room to set the table, then, once dinner ended, toward the sink to begin washing dishes, while everyone else remained comfortably seated in the living room. Emily never argued. In the beginning, she'd told herself this was simply Rebecca's way of welcoming her into the family, an old-fashioned tradition where the newest addition helped out more than the established members. She'd noticed, gradually, that Rebecca's biological daughter Claire never once touched a dish or lifted a serving spoon during these dinners, seated instead beside her husband at the table like an honored guest every single week. Emily noticed, but she said nothing, telling herself repeatedly that raising the issue would only create friction in a marriage and a family she genuinely wanted to belong to. 3 years is a long time to quietly absorb something like that, and Emily had gotten remarkably skilled at doing exactly that, smiling through it, changing the subject when friends asked how her in-laws treated her, telling herself privately that David's relationship with his mother mattered more than her own discomfort over a few hours of chores each week. She loved David deeply, and some part of her had convinced herself that protecting his peace with his mother was simply part of what loving him well looked like, even when it meant absorbing something that quietly wore at her, week after week, for 3 straight years. David, for his part, had no real understanding of any of this, largely because he was almost never present in the kitchen during the exact moments Rebecca directed Emily toward another task. He'd occasionally notice Emily seemed tired after these dinners, occasionally catch her rubbing her hands after a long stretch of washing dishes, but he'd never once connected these small details into anything resembling a pattern worth questioning. His mother had always been particular and traditional, and David had simply grown up believing that was just who she was, never once considering that particular and traditional might actually mean something far less innocent when it came to how she treated his wife specifically. That particular Sunday started differently only because of an unexpected cancellation at David's office, a client meeting pushed to the following week, freeing up his entire afternoon in a way that hadn't happened in months. Rather than calling ahead, David decided to surprise Emily by picking her up early and heading to his mother's house together for once, instead of Emily arriving separately after her own errands, the way she usually did on Sundays. He pulled into his mother's driveway nearly 2 hours earlier than his usual arrival time, letting himself in through the side door out of habit, the same door he'd used his entire childhood, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen, and Emily helping her the way she always seemed to be doing whenever David wandered in from the living room. What David actually walked into, standing quietly just inside that familiar side door before either woman noticed his presence, was something he'd genuinely never witnessed from this particular angle before, at this particular time, uninterrupted by his own habit of immediately joining in to help. He stood frozen for a moment in the hallway, watching a scene unfold that had apparently been happening exactly like this every single Sunday for 3 years, completely invisible to him until this exact, unplanned moment, when nobody in that kitchen knew he was standing there watching it all. Standing just inside the side door, David watched his mother move through the kitchen with brisk, practiced authority, directing Emily without ever once looking directly at her while she spoke. "The potatoes need another 10 minutes, and the good tablecloth is still in the hall closet. Get that out before Claire arrives," Rebecca said, not glancing up from the pot she was stirring, the words landing more like instructions to staff than requests to family. Emily moved immediately, retrieving the tablecloth, smoothing it over the dining table with quick, practiced efficiency, the kind of efficiency that told David this exact sequence had happened enough times to become muscle memory rather than a single unusual afternoon. David remained frozen in the hallway, unseen by either woman, watching Emily work through a checklist he'd genuinely never witnessed her performing before, not because it had never happened, he now understood with a sinking clarity, but because he'd simply never been standing in this exact spot, at this exact time, to see it unfold, without his own presence changing the dynamic. He watched his mother direct Emily toward the good china next, watched Emily retrieve it from a high cabinet without complaint, watched the entire scene move with the fluid, rehearsed quality of something that had clearly been repeating itself for a very long time. Claire arrived roughly 15 minutes later, letting herself in through the front door with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once needed to check whether dinner preparations were underway, calling out a cheerful greeting before settling directly into a chair at the dining table, without so much as glancing toward the kitchen. Rebecca greeted her daughter warmly, offering her a glass of wine, chatting easily about Claire's week, while Emily continued moving quietly between the stove and the table, refilling water glasses, adjusting place settings, entirely unacknowledged by either woman in the room. The moment that finally cracked something open in David happened almost casually, the kind of small cruelty that lands hardest precisely because it's delivered without any apparent awareness of its own weight. Rebecca, noticing a faint stain on one of the cloth napkins as she set the table, simply held it out toward Emily without a word of thanks, saying only, "This one's ruined. Get a fresh one from the linen drawer, and try to be more careful with these going forward." Emily took the stained napkin without argument, replacing it quietly, her expression carefully neutral, in a way David recognized immediately as practiced, the specific blankness of someone who'd learned long ago not to let her face show what a moment like that actually cost her. David stood in that hallway a moment longer, watching his wife absorb a small, casual insult with practiced grace, understanding with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that this particular moment wasn't an aberration at all, but simply one ordinary example of something that had clearly been happening, unremarked and unchallenged, every single Sunday since his wedding day. He thought back, quickly and painfully, through 3 years of Sunday dinners, searching his memory for all the times he'd wandered in from the living room to find Emily already finishing some task in the kitchen, all the times he'd assumed she simply enjoyed helping his mother cook, all the times he'd never once questioned why Claire never lifted a finger at these same dinners. Emily glanced up moments later, reaching for a stack of plates near the hallway, and froze completely the instant she registered David standing there, clearly having been watching for some unknown length of time. Her face went through several rapid emotions at once. Surprise first, then something closer to dread, an instinctive, immediate calculation of exactly how much he might have just witnessed, and what that would mean for the careful, 3-year-long silence she'd maintained, specifically to avoid a moment exactly like this one. "David," she said quietly, setting the plates down slowly, her voice carrying a fragile, uncertain note David had never quite heard from her before. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," David said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger Emily might have expected, only a kind of stunned, careful sadness. "Long enough to see that this wasn't the first time." Emily set the remaining plates down slowly, her hands trembling slightly as 3 years of carefully maintained composure began for the first time to genuinely crack in front of him. "David, I can explain," she started, though her voice wavered on the words, uncertain even herself what explanation could possibly make this moment feel smaller than it actually was. "How long has this been happening, Emily?" David asked again, more directly this time, needing to hear the actual answer rather than continue watching her search for a gentler way to deliver it. Emily was quiet for a long moment, glancing toward the dining room where Rebecca and Claire continued their easy conversation, oblivious to the conversation unfolding just out of their sight. "Since the beginning," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since our very first Sunday dinner here. I thought it would get better once your mother knew me better. It never really did. I just got used to it." David felt something cold settle into his chest, doing rapid, painful math in his head. 3 years of Sunday dinners, roughly 150 separate evenings, where his wife had apparently been treated like hired help in his own childhood home, while he sat obliviously in the next room. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though the question came out softer than he intended, more bewildered than accusatory. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She clearly fought hard to hold back. "Because I didn't want to be the reason you and your mother had problems," she said. "Because it felt petty to complain about doing dishes when I knew how much these Sundays mattered to you. Because I kept telling myself it would eventually change, and I didn't want you choosing between us over something I thought I could just handle quietly." David reached for her hand, holding it firmly, though his mind was already moving toward the dining room, toward a conversation he understood now could no longer wait for a more convenient moment. "I need to talk to my mother," he said. "Right now, before dinner, before any of this continues even one more Sunday." Emily's grip on his hand tightened, a flash of old fear crossing her face. "David, please, don't make a scene. I don't want Claire and your mother thinking I complained behind their backs." David studied his wife's face for a long moment, understanding fully now the specific, exhausting math she'd been running for 3 years, protecting everyone else's comfort at the direct cost of her own dignity. "You didn't complain," he said finally. "I saw it myself. This isn't about what you said. It's about what I finally saw." He walked into the dining room a few minutes later, Emily following hesitantly behind him, and asked his mother plainly, in front of Claire, how long she'd been treating his wife like household staff at every single Sunday dinner. Rebecca's expression shifted instantly from warm hostess to something sharper, more defensive. "David, I don't know what you think you saw, but Emily has simply always been happy to help out in the kitchen. It's never been a problem before." Claire, seated comfortably at the table, glanced between her mother and brother with visible discomfort, clearly aware this conversation touched something she'd never once questioned herself. "I watched you hand her a stained napkin like she was staff, Mom," David said, his voice steady but firm, carrying none of his usual deference toward his mother. "I watched her do every single task in that kitchen while Claire sat here being served. This has apparently been happening every week for 3 years, and I only just found out because I happened to come home early enough to actually see it myself." Rebecca's composure cracked slightly, though what emerged from beneath it wasn't apology, but something colder, more revealing than she likely intended. "David, someone has to help in this kitchen, and frankly, Emily married into this family. It's not unreasonable to expect her to contribute a bit more than someone who's actually my daughter." The room went completely silent at that admission, Claire's face going pale, as she absorbed what her mother had just said plainly, out loud, in front of everyone. David stared at his mother for a long moment, watching her realize, almost in real time, exactly how badly that sentence had landed, though she made no immediate move to soften or retract it. Emily stood frozen beside him, 3 years of quiet, careful silence finally validated in the worst possible way, watching Rebecca's true reasoning surface at last, exposed and unmistakable in front of the entire family gathered at that Sunday table. David stood beside his mother's table for a long moment, letting her own words settle fully into the silence she'd just created, watching Claire's discomfort deepen as she realized she'd spent 3 years benefiting from something she'd never once questioned. Emily married into this family, David repeated slowly, his voice quiet, but unmistakably firm. So did I marry into a family, Mum, the day I chose her. That's exactly what marriage means. She's not staff you get to direct because she's newer than Claire. She's my wife, and she's been treated like hired help in this house for 3 years, while I sat obliviously in the next room. Rebecca's expression wavered between defensiveness and the dawning realization that her justification, spoken plainly in front of everyone, had revealed something about herself she likely hadn't intended to expose so completely. I didn't mean it exactly like that, she said, though her voice lacked full conviction now. I just meant, traditionally, the newer wife helps out more until she's settled in. David shook his head slowly. It's been 3 years, Mum. Emily is settled in. This was never about tradition. This was about you deciding she owed this family more than Claire does, simply because she wasn't born into it. Rebecca had no immediate answer for that, sitting in a silence that stretched uncomfortably across the table. Claire finally spoke, her voice smaller than usual, clearly working through her own complicated feelings about the last several minutes. Mum, I never realized. I just thought Emily liked helping in the kitchen. I never once thought to ask if she wanted a break or offered to help myself. She looked toward Emily with genuine, uncomfortable regret. I'm sorry. I should have noticed that myself, regardless of what Mum expected. Emily nodded, still too raw from the last several minutes to fully accept the apology yet, though she appreciated Claire's honesty in that moment more than she could easily put into words. David turned back to his mother, his voice calm now, but carrying a finality that hadn't existed in any previous conversation between them. Here's what happens going forward. Emily sits at this table like everyone else. She doesn't cook, serve, or clean unless she genuinely offers to, the same as Claire. If that's not something you're willing to do, these Sunday dinners end entirely, and I mean that completely. Rebecca's face paled at the real possibility of losing this weekly tradition, understanding for the first time that David's patience on this particular issue had genuinely run out. David, you can't just end family dinner over. I can, David interrupted gently but firmly, and I will, if this doesn't change starting today. Rebecca sat with that ultimatum for a long, quiet moment, the weight of potentially losing regular access to her son and, eventually, any future grandchildren settling in visibly across her face. Fine, she finally said, her voice tight but genuine in its resignation. Emily, please, sit down. I'll finish the potatoes myself today. It wasn't a full apology, and everyone at that table understood it wasn't meant to be one, not yet, but it was, unmistakably, the first real acknowledgement Rebecca had ever offered in 3 years, that something about her behavior actually needed to change. The following weeks brought slow, uneven progress, rather than any sudden transformation. Rebecca still occasionally slipped into old habits, catching herself mid-sentence when directing Emily toward some task, correcting course with visible effort, rather than natural instinct. Claire, to her credit, began deliberately involving herself in kitchen preparation for the first time in years, quietly working alongside her mother in a way that redistributed the labor more fairly, without anyone needing to say much more about it. Emily, for her part, found herself gradually settling into a version of these Sunday dinners she'd genuinely never experienced before, sitting comfortably at the table from the moment she arrived, watching David make quiet, deliberate points of serving his mother himself, small corrections accumulating steadily week after week. 3 months later, at an ordinary Sunday dinner that looked, on its surface, almost identical to every other one before it, David watched Emily laugh easily with Claire over something small, completely at ease in a way he realized, with a quiet ache, she'd rarely been able to manage during those first 3 years. Rebecca, setting the table herself for once, caught David's eye briefly across the room, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them of exactly how much had needed to change and how far there still was to go. David reached for Emily's hand under the table, holding it the same steady way he had that first difficult afternoon, understanding now that love sometimes means finally seeing clearly what's been happening all along, and refusing to look away from it ever again. If this story reminded you that real love means truly seeing the people you love, even when it takes time to notice, subscribe before you go, so you never miss the next story like it.